Tonight marks the 7-year anniversary when 24-year-old Kimberly Encinia was struck and killed by a hit-and-run driver. It happened in 2012, and her case has remained unsolved since then. You might recall we featured the case as part of our Unsolved Filed series. Kimberly was walking along Ricardo near Nile when she was struck on her way to a girls' sleepover at a nearby church and almost yards away from her destination. The driver who hit her did not stop and became the sole focus of a police investigation. The only information that police had to work with was that the vehicle was possibly a white or gray Nissan Xterra. For the last 7 years, there have been no new leads. At the time of the accident, there were no sidewalks. Her death sparked change within the city to add those sidewalks. Her mother continues to plead to the public in hopes of finding the person who killed her daughter. If you have any information that could help, call Corpus Christi Police.